Here is Visconti Blue, a blue ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
This is a very bright, vivid blue, but it isn't screaming blue on the page. I find a bunch of color variation by nib and the flow of the pen. It's only in one pen that I got much of anything for shading, maybe two, except for the occasional dark spots that show up in some words in some of the other writing. It performs well in general on non-fountain pen friendly paper with the general acceptable amount of feathering and spread on the rare occasion that it is happening. I do wish that I had used this blue much sooner in all of my ink testing. It's very pleasant on the page, and I have been enjoying it a great deal.
All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib that writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy All-Star with a broad nib that writes average.
The pen for today is a Kaweco Sport.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get a very decent blue on the page. Again, it's not as vivid as it will be in others, but it is a vivid blue, really putting nice color down on the page with this dry writing pen. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get some shading, and you can see it all fell silent on the first line, where the bottom of both of the L's are darker than the top of the L's in all. Where fell, the top of the F is lighter than the bottom of the F. It lightens into the E, darkens into those last two L's. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is much darker than it was with the soft fine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We get no shading. It's very dark for what I was expecting from this blue, much darker than I had really expected at all. This isn't really a blue for me in what I'm seeing here, though I don't see it as bad at all. Looking at the medium nib, it is much lighter than it was with the wet fine, darker than it was with the soft fine. Really nice mid-tone here with no feathering, no spread. It does have a few moments of darker spots in shading that come up, like you can see it in the Q of quietly and the ET, but it lightens a little bit into the LY. All of that's on the first line since I forgot to say where the word was. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the medium, darker than it was with the soft fine. Nice tone here, a very pleasant tone. I kind of prefer what I had with the medium over this broad, but this is still very nice. There's no feathering, there's no spread, there's no shading at all. It's just a very pleasant blue on the paper. Looking at the back of the page, with no surprises, there's no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 10 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it's about the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine, slightly duller as a result of the paper. We have no feathering and we have no spread. There's a few moments of shading that you might see like them on the second line, where the T is lighter than the hem, but even in the H, it's a little bit lighter than it was at the bottom of the H into that EM. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is much darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We get a much nicer color on the page. Still no shading coming through, but I think it's a much nicer blue than it was on the Clairfontaine. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, little duller, just as it was with the soft fine. no feathering, no spread. Few light moments of shading do happen. You see it with had on the third line, where the H is a bit darker than the A. That lightens a little bit into that D, but then gets much darker again. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as it was with the medium on this paper, which makes it a tad bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. There's no feathering. It does look to be a little bit of spread. It's manageable in what's going on there. No shading whatsoever. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that with the medium, it got quite deep into the paper, really started to splotch, made me worry about the next page. It did not touch the page underneath. I think on a majority, you could write on the back of the page, but not for all of them.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is just a little darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, very likely a result of the tone of the paper. We get no feathering and we get no spread, which is always good when it's a non-fountain pen friendly paper. We get a bit of shading that's going on. You see it in dropped and uncomfortable, first and second line. On dropped, the P's and the D are a bit darker than the other letters in the word. Where uncomfortable, the CO is a little darker than the letters around it. The F is a bit darker than the M or O, and the rest of the word is fairly a uniform tone, being lighter than that F. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is much darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading whatsoever. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, darker than it was with the soft fine, little darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now we get no feathering and we get no spread and we get no shading. We still get a very acceptable blue on this page. Looking at how it's going, I wouldn't be disappointed with this. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the medium nib, darker than it was with the soft fine, and it's close to what was there with the Clairfontaine, though not the same. I'm talking about darkness of the ink on the page. There appears to be tiny bits of feathering that do occur, like in the first word, first line, the. I see a tiny bit of feathering there, not any kind of a real big deal. Lights on the third line, tiny feathers, not a huge deal because it's not a fountain pen friendly paper. Same with the tiny bit of spread that does seem to be occurring here. But the spread in itself is not a deal breaker, but no shading. And again, still not a deal breaker here. Looking at the back of the page, you see the ink got quite deep into the paper, maybe making it so you wouldn't want to use the back of the page. I wouldn't want to use the back of the page. That's a you choice, but nothing bled through to the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get about as much shading as we had on the Clairfontaine. Most notable thing here to talk about is the quad rule. It stands out on the quad rule. It doesn't kind of blend together, making it hard to read. So if you use quad rule paper, this could be a good one for you. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is much darker than it was with the soft fine. It's the darkest tone that I get of all four of these, but it's nowhere near as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. Of course, we get no feathering, and of course, we get no spread. We do get some shading that comes through about as well as it did with the medium on the Clairfontaine. So we get some darker letters in words, but it's not shading gradually in, and it's a darker tone to begin with. Like when you look at over on the second line, the E is darker than the rest of the word, but it's not like it's really standing out. More what stands out is how battle on the first line is darker than over on the second. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading, which we did have on the Clairfontaine. It does make it a little disappointing here just because you kind of hope that the Rhodia would still always bring out all of that performance, though what we're getting is in no way a bad thing. Looking at the broad nib, it is a tad bit lighter than it was with the medium. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading, but we do get a very good blue. Looking at the back of the page, we have no bleeding, we have no ghosting. We could easily write back here.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Aurora Blue. Here is Califolio Blue. Here is Camlin Royal Blue. Here is Diamine Royal Blue.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, but not a whole lot. It is flatter looking, not as vivid a color. We have no feathering and we have no spread. We have only a couple moments of shading that do occur, like the D on "and" on the second line is a little darker than the rest of the word, sure. The parenthesis before together is a little bit darker than some of the stuff around it, but not very much going on for shading. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, much lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get shading, or at least noticeable color variation. Look at never on the second line compared to the underneath it. The is quite a bit darker. Now went on the second line starts lighter at the W, darkens a little bit at the E, lightens at the N, and gets dark again at the T. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as it was with the wet fine nib. Very surprising there. It's a tad bit lighter, I think, than it was on the Clairfontaine, just to give you an idea of how much this paper has affected the tone. There's no feathering and there's no spread. It's performing very well on here. Good for student note-taking. Not positive about it really for the lab environment based on the resistance. No shading. I mean, there's one or two spots, but I really wouldn't count on this as a shader, not on this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get some feathering. You see it in beautiful, and that is not a beautiful thing. On the IFU, you see it there quite a bit. I see it a little bit on marvelous on the first line, still not a marvelous thing. World on the third line, so there's tiny bits of it. There's no spread, so that's great. There's no shading, not expected. I'd still say this is pretty good, even with that minor feathering. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Pen BBS number 140. Here is Robert Oster Orange Zest. Here is Sailor Zodiac Aries. Here is Robert Oster Honeybee.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get feathering, we do get spread, we do get shading. You can see it in Wandered on the third line, or Wandered on the third line, where the DER is a little bit darker than the WAN up front. The last E lightens a little bit, lightens a little more into the D, but then darkens up some. So we are getting little bits of shading on this 20-pound paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get feathering, we get spread, we get a couple moments that are darker. I think the feathering and the spread in this case are distracting, and I wouldn't want to use a wet fine nib on this. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine. We get no feathering, as if that were possible on copy paper. Of course we get feathering, of course we get spread. Neither of those are really out of control and a major issue, though I wouldn't want it. My eye lands on lands, second line, in the amount of feathering that's going on. The moonlight starts to look a little bit hazy on the word light from the feathering. There's a tiny bit of spread. It's not the end of the world, though it is spreading from more to, from much more than a medium. It's not the end of the world here. It's copy paper and no shading. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium. We do get feathering and we do get spread. We do not get shading. Now, just looking at this on the page, I have a tendency to feel like I wouldn't want to use it. It looks like I'm kind of writing with a marker, though it is a broad. If you like writing with markers, go for it. Looking at the back of the page, it's pretty obvious you could not write back here. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath, so there's a good thing about it, but boy oh boy does that ink get deep into the paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The soft fine is a dry pen that this has no issue keeping the flow, and it was easy to read, and it did shade. The wet fine was ridiculously dark, almost, well, not almost, it looked like it was a different ink altogether. The medium gave a nice medium tone with some shading coming through on the more premium papers more often. The broad was just a tad lighter than the medium, but the shading was absent. So for me, it really comes down to either the soft fine or the medium, or thinking of it as a dry or medium flow pen. I like the tone just a little bit more from the medium flow, medium nib, and it's just a bit of shading gets to come with it, which is always, for me, a good thing.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.